What if the most advanced submarine of the Second World War never fired a shot in combat? By the final months of the war, Germany had developed a submarine so advanced it could cross the Atlantic Ocean submerged without surfacing even once. It was faster underwater than many ships were on the surface. It could dive deeper, stay hidden longer, and operate silently beneath the waves for days on end. It was called the Type XXI, and it represented a complete transformation in undersea warfare. But by the time these revolutionary vessels were ready, the war was already lost. This is the story of the Nazi submarines that could have changed the course of naval history, but didn't. It's a story of technological ambition, strategic desperation, and the race to outpace the collapse of a regime. From the early triumphs of the U-boat fleet, through Allied breakthroughs in anti-submarine warfare, to the last-minute development of a new kind of submarine, this documentary explores how one of the most significant innovations of the war arrived just too late. In the shadow of defeat, the Germans built the world's first true submarine. Not just a diving torpedo boat, but a machine designed to live and fight beneath the surface. Its influence would echo far beyond 1945, shaping Cold War navies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. To understand this moment of near transformation, we begin with the legacy of the early U-boat war and the man who believed submarines could strangle an empire. When the Second World War began in September of 1939, the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, was not designed for a traditional naval confrontation. Unlike the vast surface fleets of Britain and the United States, Germany's strength lay beneath the water. Submarines, or U-boats, were seen as the key to disrupting enemy logistics, attacking merchant shipping, and isolating the British Isles from the rest of the world. The strategy was simple but deadly. If German U-boats could sever the flow of food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials arriving by sea, they could starve Britain into submission. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, believed that the war at sea would not be decided by battleships, but by submarines. He famously argued that a fleet of at least 300 U-boats operating in coordinated groups could cripple Britain's economy and force it to negotiate. The first few years of the war seemed to support his theory. In the early phase, known by German sailors as the First Happy Time, U-boats hunted in small groups using a tactic known as Rudeltaktik, or wolf pack strategy. Instead of operating alone, submarines would patrol in lines across the Atlantic. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow the ships and call in reinforcements. Then, under the cover of darkness, the group would attack in waves, torpedoes striking from multiple directions. This tactic proved brutally effective. Between 1940 and 1941, German U-boats sank thousands of Allied and neutral ships, totaling millions of tons of cargo. Convoys were often lightly defended, and many of the early escorts lacked advanced radar or sonar systems. In these conditions, the U-boats held the advantage. The Type XXI submarine became the backbone of the Kriegsmarine's effort. Compact, efficient, and capable of being built in large numbers, the Type XXI was ideal for operating in the North Atlantic. Another class, the larger Type IX, had longer range and was deployed on missions as far afield as the coast of West Africa and the South Atlantic. These submarines could not remain submerged indefinitely. They had to surface frequently to recharge batteries and refresh air, but their ability to strike quickly and disappear made them difficult to counter. The U-boat crews were highly trained and tightly knit. Life aboard a U-boat was grueling. Space was limited, temperatures varied wildly, and missions could last for weeks. Crews often went without showers, fresh food, or clean clothes. Yet morale was high during the early war years, when success rates were strong and losses were low. A U-boat patrol could return with the satisfaction of having crippled enemy logistics with only a handful of torpedoes. Some commanders, such as Otto Kretschmer and Günther Prien, became household names in Germany. Kretschmer, known for his precision and economy, sank more than 200,000 tons of Allied shipping by 1941. Prien, commander of U-47, famously slipped into the British naval base at Scapa Flow and sank the battleship Royal Oak in October of 1939. These stories were celebrated in German propaganda and contributed to the myth of U-boat invincibility. But there were limits to this success. Even in the early years, cracks began to show. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a one-sided affair. The British quickly recognized the severity of the threat and began organizing convoys more efficiently. Escorts were improved and early versions of radar and sonar were introduced. Aircraft patrols expanded their reach, forcing U-boats to spend more time submerged, where they were slower and more vulnerable. Meanwhile, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park began making progress in decrypting the German Enigma machine. Although these breakthroughs would not reach their full impact until later in the war, the ability to track U-boat positions and anticipate attacks began to erode the Germans' advantage. Still, by the end of 1941, the U-boat fleet had inflicted devastating losses. It had sunk more than 2,000 Allied and neutral ships. The United States' entry into the war in December of that year gave the campaign a new target. In early 1942, German U-boats launched Operation Drumbeat, a campaign against unescorted shipping off the American East Coast. The results were catastrophic. In just a few months, dozens of tankers and freighters were torpedoed in sight of American beaches, their cargoes burning into the night. This second period of high success was called the Second Happy Time by German submariners, but it would not last. The U-boat fleet was still operating with submarines designed before the war. The Type 7 and Type 9 were capable, but they had not been designed for a prolonged underwater war. Their battery power was limited, meaning they could stay submerged only for a matter of hours before needing to surface. Surfacing exposed them to radar-equipped aircraft and escort ships. As Allied technology improved, so did their ability to track and destroy U-boats. Dönitz had long understood that the key to U-boat dominance lay not just in numbers or tactics, but in the ability to remain hidden. He had pushed for new technologies to increase underwater endurance and speed. The concept of a true underwater vessel, one that could operate for days without surfacing, was still far from reality. But the experience of early victories and growing losses convinced the Kriegsmarine that they would need a new kind of submarine to continue the fight. By mid-1942, the balance was beginning to shift. Allied shipbuilding was accelerating, with American yards producing Liberty ships faster than the Germans could sink them. Escort carriers and long-range aircraft closed the gaps in convoy coverage. U-boats that had once operated with near impunity now found themselves hunted. In May of 1943, the Germans suffered the worst monthly losses of the war, with more than 40 U-boats sunk. That same month, Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The tide had turned. The early years of the U-boat war had shown what submarines could do when technology, strategy, and surprise were in their favor. But it also revealed their limitations. German submarines could wreak havoc, but they could not win a war of attrition against a growing Allied response. To survive, the U-boat fleet needed more than new tactics. It needed a radical redesign, a submarine that could escape the surface entirely, operate at greater speeds underwater, and evade the expanding reach of Allied forces. By the middle of 1942, the Atlantic had become the most contested battleground in the world. While German U-boats had terrorized Allied shipping for the first years of the war, the tide was beginning to turn. The Allies, learning quickly and innovating rapidly, began to deploy a new arsenal of technologies and strategies that would push the U-boat fleet to the brink of collapse. What followed was a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, an escalating contest not just of ships and torpedoes, but of radar, sonar, encryption, and industrial scale. The submarine war was no longer just a matter of surprise and courage. It had become a race between detection and evasion, between codebreakers and secrecy, between factories and shipyards. One of the first major shifts came in the realm of air power. In the early years of the war, German U-boats operated with relative safety in a stretch of the Atlantic known as the air gap. a vast central zone that was beyond the reach of Allied land-based aircraft. Here, convoys were most vulnerable, and U-boat packs concentrated their attacks. But by late 1942, the Allies began closing that gap. The introduction of long-range patrol aircraft, such as the American B-24 Liberator equipped with radar, transformed the battlefield. These aircraft could patrol the mid-Atlantic, spot surfaced submarines from high altitudes, and attack before the U-boats had time to dive. Aircraft carriers adapted for escort duty added further reach to convoys, launching smaller planes to defend ships well beyond the coastline. German submarines, which had previously surfaced freely to recharge batteries and observe targets, now had to do so under the constant threat of aerial attack. At the same time, Allied surface ships were becoming more dangerous to submarines. Improvements in sonar, known then as ASDIC, allowed escort vessels to detect submerged U-boats more accurately. Depth charges became more precise, and new weapons like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar, increased the likelihood of striking a submerged target. These innovations made the deep no longer safe. But it was not just firepower that shifted the balance. Information became the most powerful weapon of all. At Bletchley Park in Britain, cryptanalysts had been working tirelessly to break the codes used by the German Navy. By 1941, they had occasional success deciphering messages sent via the Enigma machine. But in early 1942, the Germans introduced a new version of Enigma with an additional rotor, known as the Shark key. This temporarily blinded the Allies to U-boat communications. The blackout did not last long. Alan Turing and his colleagues developed new techniques and machines to break the updated code, and by the end of 1942, they were again reading large volumes of German naval traffic. This meant that Allied commanders could track U-boat movements, reroute convoys, and even set traps. While the German crews still believed their messages were secure, the British were silently reading their intentions. This intelligence breakthrough, known as Ultra, gave the Allies a strategic advantage that could not be matched by tactics or courage alone. Convoys now traveled with knowledge, where to expect an ambush, when to change course, and which areas were safe. The Germans, unaware that their communications were compromised, continued to act as if they were invisible. On the production side, the United States brought to bear an industrial capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. While Germany continued to build submarines at a steady rate, the Americans launched Liberty ships by the dozens each week. Assembly line shipyards on the east and west coasts poured out cargo vessels faster than the U-boats could sink them. Each sunken ship could be replaced in weeks. Meanwhile, every lost U-boat required months to rebuild and retrain. This imbalance in resources began to show clearly by early 1943. U-boat commanders found themselves increasingly hunted. Surfacing to charge batteries became a life-threatening act. Convoy escorts were now aggressive and coordinated, working in teams to detect, pursue, and destroy. Submarine patrols that once returned triumphant now ended in silence. One striking example came in May of 1943, a month known within the Kriegsmarine as Black May. During those 4 weeks, Germany lost over 40 U-boats. The destruction was so severe that Admiral Karl Dönitz, then Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, ordered a temporary withdrawal of his submarines from the North Atlantic. This marked a profound shift in the war. The hunter had become the hunted. The once dominant wolf packs were now scattered, disrupted, and demoralized. For the first time, Dönitz openly acknowledged that the existing fleet of Type 7 and Type 9 submarines was no longer adequate. They had been designed for a different kind of war, a war where submarines could operate near the surface, recharge batteries in safety, and strike with surprise. That kind of war was over. Even when the Germans introduced snorkels, air intake devices that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while just below the surface, it was not enough. The snorkel was noisy and fragile. It made the submarines detectable by radar and vulnerable to attack. It allowed for longer submersion, but not for true stealth. Dönitz knew that what Germany needed was not an improvement, but a reinvention. A new class of submarines had to be developed, ones that could remain submerged for the entire length of a patrol, travel at high speed underwater, and recharge batteries without surfacing. The idea of the electroboot was born. But designing such a submarine would require breaking from nearly every principle that had guided submarine construction until that point. It would require a complete overhaul of propulsion, hull design, internal systems, and production methods, and it would have to be done under constant Allied bombing and mounting resource shortages. The challenge was immense, but the concept was clear. If the Allies had claimed dominance on the surface and in the air, Germany's only hope was to disappear beneath the waves. The technological superiority of the Allies had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for German submarines. What had begun as a campaign of strategic disruption had become a war of attrition that Germany could not win. And so, in the shadow of defeat, Nazi Germany turned to engineering as a last resort, seeking to create a submarine that could survive not by striking first, but by never being found. By the summer of 1943, Germany's submarine fleet was in crisis. The once feared wolf packs had been driven from the North Atlantic. Allied ships were no longer easy targets. Instead, they traveled in heavily guarded convoys, shielded by radar-equipped aircraft and destroyers armed with sonar, depth charges, and forward-throwing weapons. The hunter had become the hunted, and Admiral Karl Dönitz knew that continuing with existing submarine designs would only lead to further losses. The turning point was not simply military, it was technological. Traditional submarines, like the German Type 7 and Type 9, were never designed for sustained underwater travel. They were surface ships that could dive for limited periods. Their diesel engines required atmospheric air to function, forcing them to surface regularly to recharge their batteries. Once submerged, they relied on electric motors with very limited endurance and low speed. These limitations were manageable early in the war, but against a modern Allied fleet, they had become fatal weaknesses. Dönitz and his advisors concluded that what Germany needed was not a better version of the old submarines. It needed a fundamentally new type of vessel, a submarine that would operate beneath the waves by default, not as a temporary refuge. This vision would evolve into the Type XXI U-boat, also known as the electroboot. The electroboot was not merely an upgraded submarine. It was a completely new class of undersea vessel, conceived from the start as a high-speed, long-endurance, deep-diving craft. The design process began in earnest in early 1943, driven by desperation, but also by an ambition to leap far ahead of Allied capabilities. German engineers had been experimenting with radical ideas even before the war, most notably under the guidance of inventor Helmuth Walter. Walter had developed a new kind of propulsion system using hydrogen peroxide to produce steam and oxygen, creating power without atmospheric air. His designs promised unmatched underwater speeds, and several experimental prototypes were built. However, the Walter system was complex, unstable, and difficult to maintain. It would not be ready for mass deployment in wartime conditions. Instead, designers opted for a more practical approach. The electroboot would use conventional diesel-electric propulsion but radically increase battery capacity and streamline the hull for sustained underwater performance. Where earlier submarines were slow and clumsy beneath the waves, the Type XXI would be fast, quiet, and agile. The heart of the new design was its battery system. The Type XXI carried nearly 3 times the battery cells of a Type 7, allowing it to remain submerged for several days at moderate speed or sprint for short periods at higher velocity. This was a revolutionary change. For the first time, a submarine could operate submerged for an entire voyage, eliminating the vulnerability of surfacing for air or battery recharge. To complement the new power system, the hull was completely redesigned. Earlier submarines had hulls shaped like ships, optimized for surface travel. The electroboot featured a fully streamlined hydrodynamic profile, closer to the shape of a fish. The conning tower, or sail, was smaller and sleeker. The hull was coated with sound-dampening materials, and moving parts were mounted on vibration-reducing structures to reduce acoustic signature. All of these changes were intended to reduce detection by sonar and passive listening devices. Speed was another priority. Underwater, the Type XXI could reach speeds of up to 17 knots, faster than many surface escort ships. It could remain submerged at 5 knots for up to 75 hours, depending on conditions. This allowed it to escape pursuit or reposition without needing to surface, a major tactical advantage in contested waters. The living conditions for the crew were also improved. For the first time, a German submarine featured a freezer for food storage, an automatic torpedo reloading system, and air conditioning. These were not luxuries. They were part of the plan to keep the crew submerged and operational for weeks without returning to port. Automation and efficiency were built into every system. But perhaps the most radical decision was not technical, it was organizational. To speed up production, the German Navy and the Ministry of Armaments adopted a modular construction system. Instead of building submarines from the keel up at a single shipyard, the Type XXI would be built in sections by different subcontractors across Germany and occupied Europe. These prefabricated sections would then be transported to assembly yards and welded together. This process, known as sectional construction, was meant to produce submarines quickly and in large numbers. It was a bold logistical solution, but it carried significant risks. The factories producing the sections often had no naval experience. Tolerances were inconsistent, and quality control became a growing problem. Furthermore, Allied bombing raids regularly disrupted transportation and damaged assembly yards, creating delays and further complications. Despite these challenges, the project advanced rapidly. By mid-1943, the first prototypes were already under construction. The German Navy placed orders for hundreds of units, expecting that the new submarine would restore dominance in the Atlantic and reverse the course of the war. Dönitz placed enormous faith in the Type XXI. He believed that, had such submarines been available in 1941, the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic might have been entirely different. His hope was that the electroboot, once operational, could bypass Allied defenses entirely, slipping beneath sonar nets and air patrols to strike at vulnerable shipping lanes. But the clock was ticking. Germany was facing mounting pressure on every front. In the east, the Red Army was advancing. In the west, Allied forces had landed in North Africa and were preparing for invasions in Italy and France. The strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly, and time was a luxury Germany no longer had. Still, the design and development of the Type XXI stood as a testament to what wartime innovation could achieve. It represented a leap in submarine warfare, a transition from the age of submersible torpedo boats to true undersea vessels. Though it emerged from desperation, the electroboot would ultimately become one of the most influential submarine designs in history. As the first production models rolled out of assembly yards, the question remained whether they could be completed, deployed, and operated in time to make a difference. Would the most advanced submarines ever built during the war have a chance to enter combat? Or would they become another lost opportunity, an idea ahead of its time, buried beneath the weight of a collapsing war effort? By the end of 1943, the German Navy had made the bold decision to shift submarine production almost entirely toward the new Type XXI electroboot. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, was convinced that this revolutionary submarine could restore Germany's fading position in the Atlantic. The design was ready. The engineering concepts had been proven. Now the challenge was to build these machines at a pace fast enough to impact the war. In ordinary times, building a new class of warship from scratch was a slow and deliberate process. But these were not ordinary times. The Kriegsmarine needed hundreds of Type XXI submarines, and it needed them quickly. With Allied forces advancing on multiple fronts, time was the greatest enemy. To meet this demand, the Nazi leadership, including Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, pushed for a radical new production model based on prefabrication and modular construction. Rather than building each submarine at a single shipyard, The Type XXI would be assembled from 8 prefabricated sections built at separate inland factories. These sections would then be transported by rail or barge to coastal shipyards for final assembly. The concept was inspired by industrial efficiency. Germany's dispersed industrial infrastructure was already experienced in producing components for tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The idea was to apply similar principles to submarine construction. It would allow the Navy to bypass bottlenecks in traditional shipyards, spread production across multiple facilities, and reduce the time from keel laying to launch. In theory, the process was supposed to cut submarine construction time from more than 1 year down to just a few months. Once the factories reached full capacity, the goal was to complete nearly 1 submarine per day. Speer proudly predicted that the Type XXIs would arrive in massive numbers, overwhelming Allied shipping with a new generation of stealthy, powerful underwater hunters. To implement this strategy, Germany selected several major industrial firms to produce the individual sections. Companies like AG Weser in Bremen, Schichau Werke in Elbing, and Deutsche Werft in Hamburg were tasked with final assembly. Meanwhile, smaller factories in inland cities such as Kassel, Dessau, and Rostock were contracted to manufacture hull segments, engines, battery units, and control systems. Despite the urgency of the project, the realities on the ground quickly began to clash with the ambition of the plan. Many of the inland factories had little or no experience in shipbuilding. They lacked the tools, skilled labor, and technical expertise to build submarine parts to the exacting tolerances required. Welding errors, misaligned joints, and incompatible components became frequent problems. Sections often arrived at assembly yards needing extensive rework before they could be joined together. Rather than accelerating production, the modular approach introduced new layers of complexity and delay. Even worse, the growing intensity of the Allied bombing campaign put enormous pressure on transportation routes and industrial infrastructure. Railways were targeted regularly, and ports were under constant threat. Transporting massive submarine sections across a war-torn country became a logistical nightmare. In many cases, completed modules sat idle, waiting for safe passage, while assembly lines ground to a halt. Adding to the strain was the increasing reliance on forced labor. Germany's wartime economy had become heavily dependent on laborers from occupied territories, concentration camp prisoners, and political captives. These individuals worked under brutal conditions, with minimal training, low morale, and virtually no concern for quality. Sabotage was common. Mistakes went uncorrected. Many of the early Type XXI submarines were launched with serious flaws that rendered them unfit for combat without major repairs. The pressure to meet quotas also compromised inspection and testing. Shipyards were ordered to complete vessels on a fixed schedule, regardless of the condition of the components they received. As a result, many Type XXI submarines were delivered incomplete or with critical systems missing or malfunctioning. Some had to be towed back into dry dock before they ever left harbor. Others were hastily fitted out at sea, with crews scrambling to learn unfamiliar systems on vessels still plagued by technical faults. Nevertheless, the sheer scale of the program was impressive. By early 1944, hundreds of submarines were under construction. Hull numbers were assigned, and crews were being trained on simulators and shore-based mock-ups. In total, more than 100 Type XXI submarines were launched by the end of the war, although only a handful were completed to the point of being operational. Each Type XXI boat was built to the same general design, but minor variations crept in due to the decentralized production model. Tolerances varied from ship to ship, and retrofitting parts in the field became a difficult task. Standardization, one of the original goals of the modular approach, proved elusive under wartime conditions. The delays had serious consequences. By the time the first Type XXI submarines were ready for trials, the Allies had already landed in Normandy. The front was closing in from both east and west. Ports in France and the Low Countries were under threat or already lost. Submarines that had once operated from bases like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire now had to rely on shrinking facilities along the German and Danish coasts. Dönitz remained committed to the program, even as its limitations became clear. He hoped that even a limited number of operational electroboot could force the Allies to divert resources and delay their advance. But each delay, each bottleneck, each bombing raid made that vision less realistic. In a desperate attempt to accelerate deployment, some Type XXI submarines were sent to sea before their systems were fully tested. Crews were unfamiliar with the complex new machinery. In many cases, the submarines had to be towed to training areas or harbors, unable to function independently. Sea trials revealed persistent mechanical problems, including leaking seals, electrical faults, and engine malfunctions. Still, the design itself remained promising. Allied intelligence was aware that a new type of submarine was under development, but its capabilities were not fully understood. Captured documents and reconnaissance reports described a faster, quieter, and more advanced submarine than anything the Allies had encountered. There was growing concern among naval planners that if Germany managed to deploy the Type XXI in significant numbers, the balance of power in the Atlantic could shift once more. But that scenario never materialized. The mass production system envisioned by Speer and the Kriegsmarine had been sabotaged from within by overambition, poor coordination, labor shortages, and the relentless weight of Allied pressure. The electroboot may have been the most advanced submarine design of the war, but its development was trapped in a collapsing empire. What was intended as a leap into the future had become a race against defeat, and as the war entered its final year, the few Type XXI submarines that made it to sea would face a world far different from the one they had been built to dominate. The Type XXI was unlike any submarine the world had seen before. Developed in the shadow of looming defeat, this vessel represented a complete rethinking of undersea warfare. Where earlier U-boats were essentially surface ships that could submerge temporarily, the Type XXI was built from the keel up to live underwater. Every aspect of its design reflected that philosophy. It was not just more advanced than its predecessors, it was a fundamentally different kind of machine. At the core of the Type XXI's capabilities was its unprecedented battery capacity. Traditional German submarines, such as the Type VII, relied on a relatively small bank of lead-acid batteries. These allowed for only a few hours of submerged travel at slow speeds before the boat had to surface and recharge. The Type XXI, by contrast, carried more than twice as many battery cells. This gave it an underwater endurance of several days, depending on speed, and allowed it to cover hundreds of nautical miles entirely submerged. For the first time, a submarine could theoretically cross the Atlantic without surfacing at all. This endurance was paired with a revolutionary underwater speed. The streamlined hull of the Type XXI was optimized not for surface travel but for silent movement below the waves. Its outer shell was smooth and hydrodynamic, with no deck guns or protruding fixtures to create drag. The conning tower was reduced in size and shape to further reduce turbulence. In trials, the Type XXI achieved submerged speeds of up to 17 knots, almost double that of the older U-boats, and even faster than many Allied surface escorts. Unlike its predecessors, the Type XXI could sustain underwater movement for hours at a time without sacrificing stealth or maneuverability. This made it extremely difficult to detect and track. In theory, it could approach a convoy, launch a torpedo attack, and escape while remaining submerged throughout the mission. This was a dramatic departure from earlier tactics, where U-boats had to surface frequently and were often forced to flee at slow speeds while underwater. The propulsion system was built around two supercharged diesel engines for surface travel and battery recharging, and two powerful electric motors for submerged operation. Additionally, the Type XXI had two smaller creep motors designed for silent running. These motors allowed the submarine to move at low speeds while making minimal noise, a crucial feature when evading sonar-equipped escorts. One of the most innovative features was the snorkel system. Although it had been introduced on earlier U-boats, the Type XXI integrated it as a core part of its design. The snorkel allowed the submarine to run its diesel engines and recharge batteries while submerged just below the surface, drawing in air through a retractable intake mast. This minimized the amount of time the submarine had to expose itself, reducing the risk of detection by radar-equipped aircraft. Torpedo handling was another area where the Type XXI broke new ground. It featured 6 bow torpedo tubes, all capable of rapid reloading. In traditional U-boats, reloading torpedoes was a manual process that could take several minutes per tube. The Type XXI employed a hydraulic loading system that could reload all 6 tubes in less than 10 minutes. It carried 23 torpedoes in total, giving it a higher sustained firepower than any previous German submarine. This firepower was supported by advanced sonar and targeting systems. The Type XXI was equipped with an array of hydrophones and passive sonar equipment that allowed it to detect and track ships from a significant distance. While German radar technology had lagged behind that of the Allies, the Type XXI was fitted with improved electronics that made it more effective in locating and engaging targets while submerged. Inside, the submarine was surprisingly modern. The crew lived in better conditions than on earlier U-boats. Compartments were more spacious, and the vessel included amenities that reflected its long-endurance mission profile. Air conditioning helped manage internal temperatures during extended patrols. A refrigeration unit allowed the crew to store perishable food, reducing their reliance on canned or dried rations. Water distillation units improved onboard hygiene and comfort. Automation played a greater role as well. Systems were designed to be easier to operate, and the control layout was more centralized, allowing for quicker responses during combat or evasive maneuvers. Training materials emphasized the new handling characteristics and submerged tactics, preparing crews for a very different kind of undersea warfare. Still, these innovations came with trade-offs. The complexity of the Type XXI made it more difficult to maintain, especially under the chaotic conditions of wartime production. Crews often had to learn new procedures quickly without the benefit of extended training periods. Many of the early boats suffered from teething problems, leaking seals, electrical faults, and misaligned components that needed to be corrected during sea trials or in dry dock. Yet, for all its imperfections, the Type XXI pointed clearly toward the future. Naval analysts and engineers who examined captured boats after the war were struck by how advanced the design was. American and British officers described it as a quantum leap over existing submarine technology. One American naval engineer famously remarked that if Germany had deployed even a few dozen fully operational Type XXI boats in 1943, it could have dramatically altered the outcome of the war at sea. Its potential was not just in its individual components, but in how they worked together. The hull shape, battery power, propulsion, weapons systems, and crew accommodations were integrated into a coherent whole. It was the first submarine built not as a surface ship that could dive, but as a true undersea vessel, a platform designed to operate unseen for long periods and to strike from the deep with precision and speed. The concept of the submarine had come full circle. From the primitive craft of the First World War to the surface-bound U-boats of the early Second World War, submarines had always been constrained by the need to surface, to breathe, and to flee. The Type XXI erased those constraints. It could stay hidden, travel far, and hit hard, all while avoiding detection. Although it arrived too late to change the course of the conflict, the Type XXI represented a technological legacy that would shape the future of naval warfare. Its innovations laid the groundwork for post-war developments in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Designs like the American Guppy program and the Soviet Whiskey-class submarines borrowed heavily from the electroboot's principles. Eventually, nuclear-powered submarines would push those ideas even further, but the foundation had been laid in the war-torn shipyards of Germany. Yet, for all its promise, the Type XXI was still a weapon of a collapsing regime. The question was whether it could be deployed in time and in sufficient numbers to make any difference on the battlefield. That answer would be revealed not in blueprints or workshops, But in the waters of the North Atlantic, where a few of these submarines finally put their capabilities to the test. By the middle of 1944, the Type XXI submarine, Germany's most advanced naval weapon, was finally nearing readiness for combat. After years of development, hundreds of incomplete hulls, and countless delays, the first electroboot began reaching operational status. But the world into which they emerged had changed dramatically since the project's inception. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was advancing through Eastern Europe. German cities were in ruins from relentless bombing. The Kriegsmarine, once a strategic force, was now fighting a desperate rearguard action. Despite the chaos, Admiral Karl Dönitz remained determined to deploy the Type XXI. He believed that if even a few of these submarines could get into the Atlantic, they might inflict enough damage to force the Allies to divert resources, slow their advance, and possibly shift momentum at sea. It was a narrow hope, but in a war Germany was clearly losing, any disruption to Allied supply lines was seen as a potential lifeline. The first fully assembled and sea-tested Type XXI was U-2511, completed at Blohm and Voss shipyards in Hamburg. Her commanding officer was Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, an experienced U-boat commander who had served with distinction earlier in the war. U-2511 was commissioned in March of 1945 and assigned to the 31st U-boat flotilla for training and final preparations. Schnee's orders were clear: conduct a combat patrol in the North Atlantic using the electroboot's revolutionary capabilities. Stay submerged, approach unseen, and strike at Allied shipping without surfacing. The submarine had been through months of sea trials and had corrected many of the production issues that had plagued earlier units. It was, by all accounts, ready. But the war was not. By this point, German ports were under siege. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, and naval patrols sealed off access to the open ocean. Submarines departing from bases like Bergen or Trondheim had to thread a deadly gauntlet of mines, sonar nets, and escort vessels. Even with the Type XXI's advanced features, getting to the Atlantic undetected was a formidable task. In late April of 1945, U-2511 set out on her first and only war patrol. Schnee took her westward, diving deep beneath the sea, using the snorkel system to recharge batteries and staying submerged as long as possible. The submarine's quiet running and high underwater speed allowed her to evade detection throughout the mission. According to post-war reports, U-2511 approached a British cruiser group near the coast of Scotland. Schnee maneuvered into firing position, lined up his torpedoes, and then received the ceasefire order. It was May of 1945. Adolf Hitler was dead. The German government had collapsed. The war in Europe was over. Schnee broke off the attack and returned to port without firing a shot. His was not the only Type XXI submarine to be deployed in those final weeks. Several others, including U-3008 and U-2529, were launched and prepared for combat, but none managed to carry out an effective patrol. Some were caught in port and destroyed by air raids before they could leave. Others suffered mechanical failures during shakedown cruises. A few were scuttled by their own crews under Operation Regenbogen, a final order from Dönitz to prevent advanced technology from falling into Allied hands. In the end, of the more than 100 Type XXI hulls launched, only a handful ever went to sea. None sank an enemy ship. Their presence, however, caused considerable alarm among Allied naval planners. Intelligence reports suggested that Germany was preparing a new class of super submarines that could strike without warning and vanish below sonar range. The Allies had no equivalent vessel in service, and while the war was clearly in its final phase, the potential long-term threat of these submarines was taken seriously. That sense of urgency was reflected in Allied actions during the final months of the war. British and American forces prioritized the capture of German naval facilities, including submarine pens and design documents. As Germany surrendered, dozens of U-boats were taken as war prizes. Some were recovered intact, while others were found scuttled or damaged beyond repair. For the crews who had trained for months aboard the Type XXIs, the end came quietly. Many had spent more time learning the complex systems of the electroboot than actually operating them in combat. Their experiences, though brief, offered a glimpse into what submarine warfare might look like in the future. The failure of the Type XXI to make an impact during the war was not a failure of design, but a failure of timing. Had the program begun earlier, perhaps in 1941 or 1942, it might have changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. By the time it entered service, Germany had lost the resources, territory, and strategic initiative needed to support it. There were also internal obstacles. The modular construction system, while innovative in theory, had introduced severe quality control problems that took months to resolve. The decentralized production model slowed integration. Many submarines were launched incomplete and had to undergo major repairs or upgrades before being deemed seaworthy. Even then, crews were often rushed through training, leaving them unfamiliar with systems that required careful handling. Furthermore, Germany's deteriorating military position meant that ports were constantly under threat. Submarines could not remain in dock long enough to be fitted out properly. Supply chains were broken. Replacement parts were scarce. Skilled labor was increasingly difficult to find. Even with the most advanced submarine in the world, Germany lacked the infrastructure to support it. Yet, despite these obstacles, the Type XXI's brief and limited deployment remains one of the most remarkable what-if moments of the Second World War. It was a weapon that embodied the future, built in the past. It showed what could be done with focused engineering, even in the midst of collapse. And though it did not turn the tide for Nazi Germany, it left an impression that would shape naval strategy for decades to come. When the war ended in May of 1945, the surviving Type XXI submarines were seized by the Allies. They were examined, tested, and in some cases commissioned into foreign navies. The Americans, British, and Soviets all took possession of these submarines, eager to study the design in detail. The combat record of the Type XXI was blank, but its story was far from over. When the war in Europe came to an end, in May of 1945, the victorious Allies found themselves in possession of one of Nazi Germany's most remarkable military innovations, the Type XXI electroboot. Although it had not altered the outcome of the conflict, its revolutionary design captured the attention of naval strategists across the world. What began as a desperate attempt by Germany to reclaim control of the Atlantic quickly became the foundation for the next era of submarine warfare. The Allies were well aware of the Type XXI's potential even before the war ended. Intelligence reports had hinted at a new class of German submarine capable of extended underwater operations, high speed, and minimal detection. But it was not until these vessels were captured, examined, and tested that the full extent of their capabilities became clear. Following Germany's surrender, more than 100 surviving U-boats were rounded up as part of Operation Deadlight, a coordinated Allied effort to eliminate the remnants of the German submarine fleet. The operation aimed to prevent the technology from falling into the wrong hands, particularly the Soviet Union, with whom wartime cooperation was already giving way to post-war rivalry. The plan was to scuttle most of the submarines in deep water off the coast of Northern Ireland. However, before the destruction began, the most advanced examples, especially the Type XXI boats, were carefully inspected, studied, and in some cases claimed as war prizes. The three main Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, each selected several U-boats for detailed evaluation and technological analysis. The United States took possession of at least 4 Type XXI submarines, including U-2513 and U-3008. These were brought across the Atlantic to the Naval Operating Base in Key West, Florida, where they underwent a series of rigorous trials. American engineers, technicians, and naval officers were astonished by the design. They noted the exceptional submerged performance, silent running capabilities, and forward-thinking systems integration. U-2513 even carried a very notable passenger. In December of 1947, President Harry S. Truman boarded the submarine for a demonstration dive. The boat submerged off the coast of Florida with the president aboard, reaching depths that American submarines at the time could not safely match. The event was as symbolic as it was practical. It showed that the United States took the lessons of the Type XXI seriously. American naval planners quickly began incorporating German design features into their own submarine programs. The Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, better known as GUPPY, was launched in the late 1940s. It retrofitted existing American submarines with improved batteries, streamlined hulls, snorkel systems, and sonar technologies, all directly inspired by the Type XXI. These upgrades allowed older American boats to remain competitive during the early Cold War and bridge the gap between World War-era designs and the coming generation of nuclear-powered submarines. The Soviet Union, too, acted quickly to capitalize on its share of captured U-boats. Several Type XXI vessels were taken to Soviet shipyards, dismantled and studied. Soviet engineers closely examined the propulsion systems, battery arrangements, hull design, and acoustic insulation. The Soviets would eventually develop the Whiskey-class and Zulu-class submarines, both of which bore a strong resemblance to the German electroboot. Unlike the Americans, who modernized existing boats, the Soviets focused on building new fleets. The first Soviet submarines to incorporate Type XXI features began appearing in the early 1950s and were produced in significant numbers. This marked the beginning of a rapid Soviet naval expansion that would challenge Western naval dominance throughout the Cold War. The British, too, evaluated captured Type XXI boats, though on a smaller scale. One vessel was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS N41 and used for trials and experiments. British designers took note of the improved hydrodynamics and power systems, which would later inform the design of their Porpoise-class submarines in the mid-1950s. What all three major powers realized was that the electroboot was not merely a product of wartime desperation, it was a blueprint for the future. Its key innovations became the standard features of post-war submarine design. Streamlined hulls optimized for underwater travel, larger battery capacity for extended submerged endurance, integrated snorkel systems for underwater diesel operation, advanced sonar and quieting technologies, centralized control systems and crew comfort features. These advances helped transition submarines from surface raiders that occasionally submerged to true undersea vessels capable of long-duration patrols, stealthy maneuvering, and independent operation. The influence of the Type XXI extended beyond technology. It also transformed naval doctrine. Before the electroboot, submarines were viewed as tactical weapons, best used for commerce raiding or ambushing enemy fleets. Afterward, they became strategic assets. Submarines could now stay hidden for weeks, navigate vast distances without surfacing, and potentially launch surprise attacks on distant shores. In the decades following the war, the Type XXI's influence could be traced in nearly every submarine fleet in the world. From the United States Navy's Skipjack class to the Soviet Union's Hotel class, and even into the designs of non-nuclear diesel-electric submarines, the core principles developed by German engineers in the early 1940s continued to echo. Ironically, the technology designed to save a collapsing regime ended up strengthening the navies of the victors. The Type XXI did not win the war for Germany, but it shaped the peace that followed. Its legacy was visible in the standoff between East and West, in the silent patrols of submarines beneath the Arctic ice, and in the evolution of underwater warfare. Even nations that had not taken part in the Second World War began adopting similar design concepts. Countries like Sweden, France, and Japan studied post-war developments carefully, eventually producing their own advanced diesel-electric submarines based on the same underlying ideas. Perhaps the clearest sign of the Type XXI's impact was how quickly older submarines became obsolete. Within a few years of the war's end, many navies had either retired their pre-war submarines or converted them using the principles borrowed from the electroboot. The underwater battlefield had been reshaped permanently, and there was no going back. The captured Type XXI boats themselves had varied fates. Some were used for years in testing and training, Others were eventually scrapped or used as targets for weapons testing. A few sank during sea trials, but the knowledge they provided was invaluable. In some sense, they served as floating classrooms, teaching a new generation of naval engineers how to think differently about life beneath the sea. By the early 1950s, the next major leap in submarine technology was already underway: the development of nuclear propulsion. Yet even these new vessels carried within them the DNA of the Type XXI. Nuclear power extended submerged endurance from days to months, but the streamlined hulls, sonar arrays, quiet propulsion systems, and submerged tactics had all originated in that bold wartime experiment. As the Cold War deepened and the world's oceans became the stage for a silent arms race, the legacy of the Type XXI was everywhere. Its design had been born in crisis, built in haste, and launched in the final days of a doomed war, but its influence would stretch for generations. The Type XXI submarine was never the game-changer its creators had hoped it would be, at least not during the war it was built for. It never turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. It never halted the Allied advance. It never carried out a successful combat patrol. And yet, more than 75 years later, its influence is still felt in every corner of the world's oceans. This was a weapon that came too late to alter history, but early enough to shape the future. At the end of the Second World War, most of the remaining Type XXI submarines were either scrapped, sunk in Operation Deadlight, or taken by the victorious Allies for study and experimentation. Few survived the transition from Nazi Germany's final months to the post-war world. But one example, U-2540, was not only preserved but eventually restored, becoming the only Type XXI submarine that remains intact to this day. U-2540 was launched in early 1945 and scuttled by her own crew in May of that same year, just days before the German surrender. She never went on a war patrol. For years she lay beneath the shallow waters off the coast of Flensburg, largely forgotten. But in the mid-1950s, as the Federal Republic of Germany began rebuilding its military under NATO, the submarine was raised from the sea floor. The decision to salvage U-2540 was more than symbolic. West Germany, now a Western ally, sought to rebuild a naval force capable of defending its coastlines and contributing to the Atlantic Alliance. The raised electroboot was renamed Wilhelm Bauer in honor of a 19th-century German submarine pioneer and recommissioned into service with the Bundesmarine. From 1957 onward, Wilhelm Bauer served as a research and training vessel. She was never used for combat, but her advanced design made her an ideal platform for testing new technologies. She helped train a new generation of German submariners and contributed to the development of post-war German diesel-electric submarines, such as the Type 205 and Type 209. After decades of service, Wilhelm Bauer was retired in the 1980s, but instead of being scrapped, she was preserved and converted into a museum ship. Today, she rests in the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, meticulously restored to reflect her original wartime design. Visitors can walk her decks, explore her compartments, and gain first-hand insight into one of the most advanced submarines of the Second World War. Wilhelm Bauer stands not just as a relic of the past, but as a testament to the engineering vision that created her. She is the last physical embodiment of a design that bridged two eras, between the crude, surface-reliant U-boats of the early 20th century and the sleek, deep-diving submarines that now patrol the oceans. But the Type XXI's legacy extends far beyond one surviving hull. It lies in the design philosophies that it pioneered and the doctrines that it influenced. One of the most important ideas born from the electroboot was the concept of true submarine warfare, the notion that submarines should operate primarily underwater, not as surface ships that occasionally dive. Before the Type XXI, most submarines spent the majority of their time on the surface, diving only when threatened or during attacks. The electroboot changed that. It showed that with enough battery power, improved hydrodynamics, and streamlined systems, submarines could live beneath the surface for extended periods. This shift in mindset would guide naval development for decades. Even in the nuclear age, when submarines gained the ability to remain submerged for months rather than days, the underlying design principles of the Type XXI remained relevant. The hull shapes of early nuclear boats, such as the American Skipjack class and the Soviet November class, were direct descendants of the electroboot's streamlined form. Silent propulsion systems, centralized controls, improved sonar, and crew habitability all were rooted in the innovations of the German design. Another legacy of the Type XXI was its influence on Cold War naval strategy. Submarines became more than just commerce raiders. They became platforms for reconnaissance, special operations, and most critically, nuclear deterrence. Ballistic missile submarines capable of delivering devastating second strike capabilities from beneath the sea owed their existence to the belief that submarines could operate unseen and undetected for long periods. That belief was proven in part by the electroboot. The Type XXI also helped usher in a new age of diesel-electric innovation. While nuclear propulsion would come to dominate the fleets of major powers, many nations continued to develop advanced non-nuclear submarines. These boats, optimized for littoral and coastal defense, borrowed heavily from the Type XXI's structure. Modern submarines from Sweden, Japan, South Korea, and Germany itself all trace their lineage back to the electroboot. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Type XXI lies in what it represents. An example of how innovation, no matter how brilliant, can be rendered ineffective by poor timing, flawed execution, and a deteriorating strategic environment. The Type XXI was a masterpiece of engineering, but it could not escape the realities of war. Its construction was hampered by rushed schedules, poor quality control, and bombing raids that crippled infrastructure. Its crews were often undertrained and sent to sea with incomplete systems, and by the time it was ready, it was already too late. The submarine that could have changed the Battle of the Atlantic arrived in a world where the Atlantic had already been won. Still, the Type XXI serves as a reminder that technological breakthroughs do not always change the present, but they often shape the future. It was not the weapon Germany needed in 1945, but it became the vessel that navies around the world would study, emulate, and refine for decades. In a quiet corner of a German harbor, one can still climb aboard Wilhelm Bauer and stand in the control room of a machine that, for a brief moment, promised to alter the nature of naval warfare. It is a place of cold metal, narrow corridors, and silent history. No battles were fought from within her hull, no ships were sunk, but in that silence lies something else, a glimpse of what was almost possible. In the end, the story of the Type XXI is not one of triumph or failure, but of transition. From surface-bound hunters to deep-diving predators, from wartime urgency to peacetime legacy, from the last days of one war to the quiet beginnings of another. It was a submarine ahead of its time, built too late for victory, but just in time to shape the age that followed.